and welcome to our first session for Business Finance 2. Today we will look at bond valuation. The name once again is Dr. Vera Fiador. Now, at the end of this session, students should be able to differentiate between bonds and what we'll call other debt instruments, explain the basic types of bonds available and the important bond features, know how to value bonds for investment or funding purposes, and understand the term structure of interest rates and how that may influence or how that is related to bond yields. Now, for the key issues to be outlined, we'll look at bonds, the features and the types of bonds, and then we'll also go on to look at understanding bond values, fluctuations, and determinants of bond yields. Now, when we want to look at a bond, we can look at a bond as a loan by one party, typically the investor or the holder, to another party, the issuer. Now, the issuer gives the investor a guarantee that he or she will pay interest on the facility at regular intervals and repay the principal at a specified time in the future. So typically, a bond is a debt instrument that is issued on the financial market for investors to participate, and for the issuer, it's a source of raising funding, typically debt financing. Now, the bond is a legally binding agreement typically between the borrower and the lender, and normally will specify first the face value, the coupon rate, the coupon payment, and the maturity date. Now, let's try and understand the features. Now, the face value or the par value is the amount that is typically repaid after the loan term or at the maturity of the loan. So, upon maturity, the value at which the bond is redeemed typically refers to the face value. Now, the coupon payments are the regular promised interest payments that will be made periodically, either at intervals of 6 months or annually. And the coupon rate is the annual coupon rate or the coupon amount divided by the face value, and that's what normally determines how much in terms of the coupon payments that you're getting. Now, the maturity date is the number of years until the bond matures and the face value is paid. The yield to maturity is the typical interest that is required on the market for the particular kind of bond. Now, the yield to maturity typically is related to the risk profile of the issuing entity and the bond in question that is being issued. Now, when you want to characterize a bond, you can do that in terms of one, the issuer, the size and the currency, the type, whether it has got coupon payments and the frequency of those coupon payments, the redemption amounts and the maturity dates, and whether it has embedded options as to under what circumstances the bond can be redeemed early, so whether it's got call features or warrants and all. And then the other guarantees relating to the payment of interest and return of capital, and whether it is quoted and traded, and then also the kind of default risk that is attached to it. In this case, that's the risk that the issuer will not make interest or principal repayments. Now, typically, these are the features that we'll look at when pricing a bond and how those could influence the actual value for which you should offer or pay for a bond. Now, in general, the categories of bonds can either be put as coupon paying bonds or non-coupon paying bonds. Now, bonds that pay coupons are normally referred to as coupon paying bonds, as I mentioned, in contrast to non-coupon paying bonds that we normally refer to as zeros or pure discount bonds. Now, other bonds actually may pay coupons and be that indefinitely and never mature, in which case is similar to what we refer to as a perpetuity, and an example is a console. Now, when it comes to bond valuation, because the bond pays coupons over a particular period of time, and these coupon payments are normally fixed interest payments and run for a period of time, then they take on the features similar to annuities, which typically reflect that we've got constant payments with constant intervals over a definite period of time. So that becomes coupons. And at the end of the loan term, we get to receive the face value. So now the bond value therefore literally reflects the present value of the coupons to be received over the life of the bond, and finally the present value of the face value to be received. So when we put all those together, a typical bond valuation formula is going to look like this, where we've got the coupons discounted using the required rate of return, which is normally the yield to maturity on the market, and then also in addition to the discounted face value. Now this is the basic bond pricing equation. Now, so let's consider a bond with a coupon rate of 10% and an annual, and that gives annual coupons. It has a par value, or referred to the face value, of 1,000. The bond has 5 years to maturity. The yield to maturity, intrinsically referring to the required return that investors want on the market, is 11%. Now, what is the value of the bond? Another way to look at this is to look at how much investors will be willing to pay for this bond. Now, to compute our C, which is our coupon rate, and we know that our coupon amount is the coupon rate multiplied by the face value or the par value of the bond. So at this point, we've got a coupon rate of 10% and a face value of 1,000. And so our coupon amount in this particular scenario is going to be 100. Now our T, which reflects our time to maturity, is going to be 5. The R in this case is the required rate of return, which is the yield to maturity, which is 11%. And then our par value, which will be reflected here as face value, which is 1,000. So once we feed that in, then we have the present value of the bond, which is also known as the price or the market price of the bond. Alternatively referred to as the intrinsic value of a bond. Now, on the other hand, in the event that the bond does not pay coupons, but it has a face value, then it means that at this point, the standard bond valuation formula, which comprises, or the basic formula which comprises the coupon component, disappears. And so then the bond value for a bond that doesn't pay coupons is only reflected in the discounting or the face value given the required rate of return, so that the present value component for the coupons is not included. So this is what we have as the formula. In that regard, we normally say that these bonds are priced at a discount to the face value. And so the inherent value to be attained by the investor is the difference between the price paid today and the value for which the bond is redeemed when it matures. On the other hand, when you have a perpetuity, which is typically the case for the consoles, what it means is that as T approaches infinity, the discounting portion, the main discounting portion of the annuity formula literally disappears, to be taken over by the case where we only have the coupon payments divided by the required rate of return. And so then we have the bond value, which is for perpetuity, being represented by the coupon divided by the required rate of return. Now, obviously, there are other features when it comes to the bond that you need to know, and that has to do with the bond indenture. Now, this outlines the contract between the company and the bondholders, and it normally tells us the terms of the bond, the total amount of bonds issued, a description of the property used as security, if applicable in this case, if there are sinking fund provisions, there are call provisions, and details of protective covenants. So intrinsically, the bond indenture details in totality the contracts, the whole components of the contract that tells you what your rights and responsibilities may be in relation to the bond that you have purchased from an issuing entity. Now, in terms of classification for bonds, we can look at it in terms of whether there's security provided, or sometimes in cases of what, security or seniority. Now, in terms of security, whether it's got collateral and secured by maybe other financial securities, whether it's secured by a mortgage, which is real property, normally land or buildings, and then whether it's actually just a debenture. If it's a debenture, it means it's an unsecured one. And then we also have notes, that's unsecured debts with original maturity, typically less than 10 years. In terms of seniority, you can have bonds that are classified by seniority, meaning that in the event of default or in the event that the firm goes into liquidation, these bonds that have higher seniority are given preference in the repayment of such facilities. Now, typically the coupon rates depends on the risk characteristics of the bond when issued. So a bond will typically have higher coupon rates, all else equal, but then if it's secured, then it means that the rate is likely to be lower compared to when it's a debenture which is unsecured. Now, if it's subordinated, meaning that it's lower in ranking or in terms of seniority to other senior debt, then it's likely to be given higher rates because then it's riskier. If it has got a sinking fund, then obviously there's more assurance in terms of plans for repayment, and so the rate is not likely to be that higher. But when one hasn't got a sinking fund, then of course the rate to be given is better. And then whether it's callable or non-callable also play a role in determining how much of coupons will be given, mostly in relation also to the required rates of return on the market. Now, higher grade bonds typically are marked by the Moody's AA, AAA, and the S&P's AAA, which means that capacity to pay is extremely strong. Now, as the grading drops, it means that capacity to repay begins to get weaker by the day until you can get to categories of the D's and the C's, which usually may imply that we have got junk bonds. Now, when it comes to government bonds, these are usually bonds that are written or issued on the treasury of the state, and these are normally considered quite risk-free. So examples of that may be typical federal government debt in the categories of T-bills and treasury notes and other treasury bonds. And in some cases where municipalities are allowed, they can also issue bonds accordingly. And these sometimes may come with tax-exempt status, also then sometimes reflecting in higher rates of return. We've got other types of bonds. We have disaster bonds, income bonds, convertible bonds, and put bonds. Now, a number of provisions or other types of provisions can be added to bonds, and these are very important because they influence the value that is retained by an investor once they acquire such facilities. Now, bond markets typically are primarily over-the-counter transactions with dealers connected electronically. So normally you have extremely large number of bond issues, but then in terms of daily volumes in single issues. Now, getting up-to-date prices can sometimes be difficult, especially on smaller companies or municipal issues, but treasury securities are normally the exception because there's relevant information on the market concerning such. Now, when it comes to looking at the rates that is normally used in pricing the bonds, the Fisher effect defines the relationship between real rates, nominal rates, and inflation. So when you look at the Fisher effect to determine the actual rates that you will be making, then it means that to a large extent, the yield to maturity that you're making has implicitly the real rates that you're actually making for deferred consumption and the expected rate of inflation. So given by the Fisher effect, the equation is that your nominal rate, which can be proxied as 1 plus R, is given as 1 plus the real rate multiplied by 1 plus the inflation rate. Now, the relevance of interest rate, especially the yield to maturity, determines the fact that it has a relationship with the pricing of bonds, and then also in relation to the time. So all things being equal, whenever interest rates begin to rise, the present value of the cash flows from bond payments and bond contracts begin to fall, so that A rise in interest rate translates to falling bond prices, whereas a drop in interest rates, so that it's important to understand this relationship and how that could be used. Now, normally the yield curve gives a graphical representation of the term structure looking at time and yield over time. Now, the normal case is that upward sloping curves, because when we have longer term yields, they are supposed to be higher than shorter term yields, because longer term contracts incorporate higher risk or are laden with more risk compared to shorter term investments. Now, in some cases, you can have downward sloping curves where longer term yields are lower than shorter term yields. Now, this could be a reflection of market dynamics that are worth studying. So this is the typical case for an upward sloping term structure. So then we have our interest rates, and as time to maturity, which literally reflects the risk, because the longer the term to maturity, the higher the possibility that the issuer may not be able to settle the interest and principal, hence an increment in the preferred interest rate to be paid by the issuing body. Now, this is the typical case of the downwards, and that also has to sometimes do with expectations on whether inflation is going to drop. So even though the risk premium may rise, it's mostly influenced by the expectations on inflation and the premium at that. Now, what factors therefore may affect the yield that is demanded on a bond? It has mostly to do with the default risk, which is whether or not the issuing firm will be able to pay. So you have to remember the issue of the relationship between bond ratings and ability to settle. Now, whether taxability of the premium, so whether the income made from such are taxable or not. Liquidity premium, that has to do with the fact that if the bonds are easily tradable, then it means that the required return may be lower. And then, so in any sense, anything that affects the risk of cash flows to the bondholder will typically affect the returns that are required on such investment. So this is a typical case where we graph the relationship between price and yield to maturity, and as already indicated, this is inverse. So as the interest rate on the market rises, the price of the bond falls, because intrinsically the price of the bond is the present value of all payments received over the life of the bond. Now, these are some basic relationships between the bond coupons and the yield to maturity that need to be taken care of. Where yield to maturity is equal to the coupon rate, then typically the par value of the bond becomes equal to the bond price, because then it means no excess returns are made, because the yield to maturity and the coupon rate are at par. Now, on the other hand, when the yield to maturity is higher than the coupon rate, what it means is that the firm is paying less than what the market requires, for which reason then the bond price is going to be less than the par value of the bond. That literally means that the bond will be traded at a discount. On the other hand, if the yield to maturity is less, but the coupon rate is higher, meaning that the rate that the firm is offering is way higher than the required rate of return, then the market's perception of such a bond is on the premium side, and so the bond price is going to be higher than the par value, for which reason we say that this is called a premium bond, or that the bond is priced at a premium. Now, when it comes to interest rate risk, now this typically incorporates the possibility that changes in the interest rates on the market has an impact on the price of the bond, so that if at any point in time interest rates on the markets do change, then there is a risk that the price for which you either get to sell or buy a bond can be affected. And typically that has to do also then splits, we look at it in terms of the price risk, meaning that the change in price due to the interest rates. Now, when we have longer term bonds, the price risk is higher, because then the period between the issue to maturity is longer, therefore giving room for a lot of change that may occur in terms of the interest rate that's affecting the price. And then when coupons are quite low, or a bond has low coupon payments, it normally is more sensitive to changes in interest rates on the market, hence having a higher price risk. When it comes to reinvestment rate risk, that has to do with the fact that cash flows that are received from the investments cannot be reinvested at the same rates. And for that reason, we have a case where short-term bonds therefore may have less reinvestment rate risk compared to longer-term bonds. And so then we have the case of looking at the interest rate risk and time to maturity, looking at the relationship between the bond value, the interest rate risk. So we can see that one that has, you can see the value sloping, and then when it comes to a 1-year bond, you can see that the slope is almost quite flat compared to a 30-year bond that seems to fluctuate all the way from 1,768 through to 502 over a 30-year lifespan. Now, how do we therefore compute the yield to maturity, which is normally the required rate of return that the market requires? Now, normally with the YTM, as we call it, it requires trial and error, because what you're really trying to do is to find out what rate used to value the coupons will just give you a value that is equal to the par value. And so by doing trial and error, you're able to determine at what point or what interest rates will equate the price to the par value. And at that point, you would have arrived at your yield to maturity. And so these are the examples, and then how to proceed. And so you could try your hands on the examples that have been provided, and then make meaning of how to compute that. Now, of course, when it comes to bond pricing, the main influencing factor is the risk and maturity. So normally bonds of a similar risk class would normally be priced to yield just about the same return regardless of the coupon rates. So in essence, when you want to estimate the price of another bond, once you know the YTM of one and they belong to the same risk class, you are better placed to be able to do the valuation of an alternate bond. Thank you for your time. We meet in the next session.